marking the launch of our report, Steps Forward, Steps Backward, What to Make of the Government's Plans for Higher Education Market Reform. A little bit about CMRE. CMRE exists to further research on what is impactful for student outcomes, educational equity, and for maximising wider benefits for society. I'm not going to say too much now because I'm chairing the discussion and I shall make a few remarks when we get going. But I would just like to now introduce Baroness Perry, who we're pleased to have write the foreword to the volume, and welcome her up to come and say a few words. Baroness Perry will be known to a great many of you here. Educator, educationist, academic and activist. She's long had a long and distinguished career in education. Her Majesty Chief Inspector of Schools in England from 1981. She went on to become the first woman to head a university in the UK when, having become Vice Chancellor of South Bank Polytechnic in 1987, she went on to take the institution through its transition to a university. She subsequently held other roles in higher education, including Pro-Chancellor at the University of Surrey, and more recently, President of Lucy Cavendish College, Cambridge. She was created a life peer in 1991 and subsequently served as co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Universities Group and is a member of the Royal Society's Project Science Board of Patrons. We're delighted to have her with us today to mark the launch of this essay collection on market reform of higher education. Baroness Perry.
Thank you. Am I switched on now?
I think you are now.
A bit sticking out. Well, first of all, I'd like to start by congratulating James and congratulating the organisation for having produced this. I think it's very timely. It could not have come at a better time in the history of higher education. We've got a collection of extraordinarily scholarly, thoughtful and authoritative articles, and I think we're very lucky that this has happened, so congratulations, James, and to your team. I suppose the reason that the government is doing all these horrid things, like the Green Paper and the White Paper and the Bill and all the rest of it, is because they believe, and Joe Johnson certainly, in conversations I've had with him over the last few months, believes that the market has failed. Well, here we are in the market experts. And I would like to pose a question, which I hope perhaps may come up during the discussion, is what evidence is there that the market failed? You know, my experience, I have to say, as a Vice Chancellor of Head of a Cambridge College, and lots of friends who are doing those kinds of jobs, is that we are very competitive in higher education. We're collaborative, of course, when it suits us to be collaborative, but we're also very competitive. We fight for our own institutions, and we fight for, at professorial and academic level, we fight for being the first to discover something, or the first to invent something, or the first to publish something. I wonder why they decided, just because everybody went for 9,000 fees, that somehow there was no longer a market. And I'd like to know what evidence there is that students, in choosing a university, are not behaving in a way which is market-orientated and market-driven. But that's simply the question that I have, because here we are, the government believes the market's failed, so it's got to do something else and create a market. So now it wants to create a market for teaching quality. And we're going to have new league tables before you can blink. I don't doubt as soon as they start, after phase one, as soon as they start introducing gradings on universities, and how strange it is that you grade a whole university when, you know, what happens in the engineering department might be quite different from the experience of teaching in philosophy and so on. But nevertheless, government is ploughing on, going to give universities overall ratings for their teaching quality. And as I said before you can blink, you will have league tables of universities, and I'm personally not very happy about that. I spent 5 years of my life selling British education around the world, and I know how the tiniest little, bad news or doubts can begin to change the market. International students, they do have a choice. They can go to Canada or America or Australia or Germany, which teaches It's courses in English now, and so on. And we're more expensive now than some of them, so we're not competitive in price as we used to be, we are in danger of announcing to the world that some of our universities are pretty rubbish. They got a grade 3 in their teaching quality and so on, and I don't think that's a very good idea. So I'm highly critical of the evaluation of teaching which is being proposed. I think, we're facing not only this, and I have a bit of a bee in my bonnet about it, but also we're facing the proposals in the white paper and now enshrined in the bill, that we'll have alternative providers given a very free rein. I spent a fairly difficult year last year being chair of an embryonic board of governors of one alternative provider, which shall be nameless, but which was a very wealthy alternative provider. But its knowledge of how to create quality in higher education was, in my view, rather limited. We're going to have this Office for Students, which is putting an emphasis on students, and we're going to have huge changes in the funding of research. We are wrestling already in universities with the visa problems for foreign students and so on. And Emmerich, I think, absolutely summed it up when he warned us, and thank you for that we are underestimating the scope for disruption to higher education. I don't think in my rather long life that I've ever lived through a period when there was quite such severe potential for real disruption and real difficulties. So very briefly then, a last question, which is what am I still worried about in what's in the bill? First of all, there is no, as far as I can read, there's no provision clearly for the funding and the oversight of PhD students. There's very little in the bill which explains that. I mean, where do they fall? Do they fall to the research councils? Do they fall to teaching? Where do they go? I'm concerned that there's nothing in the bill which guarantees the safeguarding of the current QR system, which I think has served us fairly well and presumably now is to be swept up. I'm worried about the relationship between existing universities and the private providers. If they're all going to be encouraged to become universities and to grant their own degrees, will they be subject to the same kind of teaching quality assessments as the old universities, and if so, how will the comparisons be made? And then finally, I think, and I do say this as a plea, I know Vice-Chancellors are very exercised about the bill and what it says, and they are making their views fairly strongly heard. I know that they are politically quite active, and they do talk to ministers and so on. But what worries me is that where the brain power is, I'm not suggesting that Vice-Chancellors don't have brain power, but where the brain power is of the people who are doing research in higher education, and not only in higher education, in free speech and in philosophy and so on, where are they in this debate? I'm very conscious that, having been a civil servant for a good part of my life, that, government has a right to have some role in the decisions that are made about public funding, about the use that's made of taxpayers' money, and they do still substantially give taxpayers' money into the higher education system. So they have a right to have some purview over what's going on. But how far does that purview go? How much intrusion is it correct and right for governments to move into what for so long has been very much a secret garden, something which was left in the trust of academics? I do think, dear friends, that those of you, and we have such brilliant essays which have addressed some of these problems, some of you who are professors, researchers, teachers in the higher education system, you have a role to play, which is not just playing politics, but which is actually trying to define logically and properly where the dividing line between government and trust in the people who run the system lies. Because in my not very humble view, the freedom of universities, the academic freedom, the freedom of speech, is under attack from so many directions of government policy. I mean, I haven't mentioned the prevent strategy and of course the Office for Students now coming along with TEF and so many things which are really threats, I think, to the traditional view of academic freedom. And perhaps they're right. I don't think I have to think they are, but perhaps they are. And as I say, I think we need some very good brains and some very good debate and some very good writing about where that dividing line should be. And I hope that in our discussions and listening today, we shall have some of that exercise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Baroness Perry. Before we launch into the panel, I might just mention to you, if those of you at the back would like to move forward, please don't feel inhibited from doing so. There's plenty of space up here as we get in, and coffee will be served to you at the table shortly. Also, we have a hashtag for people that feel inclined to be twits. Right, so market form of higher education. There's never been a period to echo what Baroness Perry said when higher education has faced so much turbulence and change and challenge as it is now, nor one for which we believe the sector and government seem so ill prepared. I'm not talking exclusively about challenges within the sector and the way it works, but also market-based challenges, which is a recurrent theme of the essays that we've assembled in this volume. Few would dispute, however, that the UK higher education sector is regarded as one of the best in the world, but in an increasingly global marketplace, it's also beginning to look increasingly uncompetitive. Despite recent efforts to induce greater competition through the introduction of tuition fees and opening the market to new supply, it remains dysfunctional from where I stand in significant ways. Most institutions charge top-up tuition fees because the availability of state-backed loans means that they can. Despite the removal of recruiting caps, few universities have expanded significantly. Demand is so great that universities still hold much of the leverage, and incentives to improve the quality of provision are lacking. There is clearly a need for more useful, reliable information for students. One of the central questions of a number of the essays is whether the TEF, the government's proposal for how what that information ought to look like regarding to quality, has it right. But the present ranking system is not grounded in empirical evidence, and indeed the quality of the data that students base their decisions on in general is at best poor and at worst misleading. The combined effect of these features is that across the system as a whole, there is little evidence of flexibility, creativity, and sensitivity to consumer demand. In face of these and other challenges, policymakers are looking for more efficient, cost-effective ways of delivering higher quality and more relevant higher education. The English government has presented its view of the priorities in the new higher education research bill in a series of essays that we published today. We assess whether the right ones and the proposed measures are likely to achieve their aims. Now, Alison Goddard, Louisa Barry to my right, Emma Meehan and Lynn Shackleton. To introduce them briefly, Alison Goddard is the editor of HE Magazine, a magazine covering policy and market trends in higher education, published by Research. How do you say that? Star Research? Asterisk Research.
We've been rebranded.
Good.
Yeah. It is the same company as publishes Research Fortnight.
Okay, good. She was formerly education correspondent at The Economist also. Louisa Darien is Deputy Director at LINPI, the higher education policy think tank. Previously she worked at Which, where she led on higher education policy and authored a number of papers. She was also recently author of a report for HEPI, Designing a Teaching Excellence Framework, Lessons from Other Sectors, which is similar focus to her essay in this volume. Emran Mian is the director of the Social Market Foundation, a former civil servant. He was secretary to the Brown Review of Higher Education Funding and Student Finance, and Director of Strategy at the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills. And finally, Professor Len Shackleton is Professor of Economics at the University of Buckingham. He was previously Dean of the Royal Docks Business School at the University of East London, and prior to that he was Dean of the Westminster Business School. He's worked with many think tanks, most closely with the Institute of Economic Affairs, and is a Sierra Marie Fellow and member of our Academic Advisory Council. So, Alison, would you like to kick us off?
Certainly. I've been given 5 minutes to speak, but I'm aware that time is tight, so I'm going to try and get everything through in 3. So I'm going to make some opening remarks, talk a bit about the Teaching Excellence Framework, and then to conclude briefly. So to start, I'm just a journalist. However, I do have almost 2 decades of experience of reporting on and off higher education. And so I have acquired some experience and learned to see the world through many different prisms during that time. I've been asked to speak on what to make of the government plans for higher education market reform. And I just wanted to set out at the outset that I don't really think that the British higher education system is broken. We've got a world-leading higher education system. We've got some of the oldest institutions in the world. They're very popular with international students. We conduct excellent research. However, 5 weeks ago, the government did publish plans to radically reform British higher education. And I wanted to turn to some of the questions that you asked, Baroness Perry, about why would they do that? And they did that to promote market reform. But what evidence is there of market failure? And I think it's more than just the way in which all universities in England charge £9,000 fees. I think there are other things, like the ways in which academic research is favoured over the provision of teaching for undergraduates, like the way in which a lot of the institutions which are run purportedly to serve students actually benefit universities. Think of the way that the universities and colleges admission services run. And that limits the number of choices that students can make. The rules stop students from applying to both Oxford and Cambridge. So I think there is, I do sympathise a little with Joe Johnson when he says there is a problem with market failure. I think also that those institutions that are selective are choosing the students rather than the students choosing them. So again, that's another sort of issue that possibly needs some attention. And like you, Baroness Perry, I also have some deep reservations about these plans. One is that I particularly dislike the way in which the power of the Royal Charters is going to be removed from universities in England. So at the moment, a lot of universities have Royal Charters that prevent ministerial meddling. It enables them to be to be answerable to the Privy Council, answerable to Parliament, not to ministers. That will change. The protection of Royal Charters will also be removed from the research councils, and the creation of the Office for Students, again, but funded entirely by universities, I think is going to be troublesome because you are thereby creating a regulator that's there to regulate its paymasters. However, those are my opening remarks. I've been asked to talk about the Teaching Excellence Framework, which is another aspect to proposed legislation. I think it's a genuine attempt to promote competition for students by incentivising high quality teaching. However, I also think that its genesis is purely political and its introduction is accidental. I think it was put into the Tory manifesto when the Conservatives were expecting to lose the 2015 general election. I've looked for this essay on which other countries have run similar exercises. There are fairly few, and the plans to introduce the scheme in England doesn't appear to have learned extensively from any of them. Australia did briefly run a system that tried to link tuition fees to teaching quality, but they had to drop it because the metrics were so volatile that tiny, statistically insignificant changes in the metrics were going to lead to big funding consequences. America and Germany also seek to measure teaching quality, but they do it very much looking at outcomes. China's got a system. The problem with the Chinese system is, although it's extensive, it covers 500 universities, everybody passes, so it's deemed reasonably plausible. So, in conclusion, the Teaching Excellence Framework doesn't learn from international experience. I think it will have some success in directing the attention of the senior management team towards teaching, but I also think it's highly likely to divert funds away from good teaching and towards demonstrating that good teaching is taking place. It also rather depends on, the whole introduction of this reforms depend on the EU vote on Thursday. That does not. If the UK votes to leave, I suspect this legislation will not be passed.
Thank you. Louisa.
So James did a little bit of an introduction to Wonky, but for those of you who haven't heard of us, we're an organisation that provides commentary and analysis about higher education policy, politics and people. And we do that through a series of articles and newsletters. If anyone wants to find out more about that, please come talk to me afterwards. I just want to start by saying that I have sympathy with some of the government reforms. Like it or not, higher education has become increasingly marketised. And in that context, information has become even more important. And yet, while there's no shortage of information in higher education, there is a dearth of the right types of information, and that's been the subject of an inquiry by the Competition and Markets Authority. Some parts of the sector have been resistant to the move to improve information in higher education. They've argued that higher education is not a normal market, that quality is difficult to define, and students don't act as savvy consumers. They also point out that providing information is somehow shaping students' preferences by making a judgment about what's important, and that's wrong. And I think there's a number of problems with that. I mean, every market has special features, and in actual fact there's very few pure markets. And the challenges around measurement and use of information certainly aren't unique to higher education. It's also not the case that we're operating in an information vacuum, as many have already noted. Information exists in league tables. Students draw on those quite heavily and see those as authoritative sources of information on quality. But they're based on poor proxies, and I think that's a problem. And the implications of that are that students aren't always making informed choices. So, for example, we know that 3 in 10 students think that the 2-1 is the same across different universities, when that's not the case. It also means that good and poor practice is less easy to identify, and I think that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen so much price competition. Having said that, I think there are challenges to the government's reforms. The overarching one being how to introduce a system that both genuinely measures what it sets out to, but also is light touch. And I think at the moment there's a risk that the government achieves neither of those things. So firstly, in relation to the metrics, in the early years, these will be based on metrics that are widely available already: retention rates, satisfaction scores, employment outcomes. I think the question there is, where's the value add, what's new? There's also issues with employment outcomes being used in the TEF. For example, people are concerned that there are better measure of students' existing abilities and the nature of the local and national labour market, rather than a measure of teaching quality. I think there's even more concern about a potential move to increase earnings data in the TEF in time. I think that poses particular risk for diversity of HE if institutions start shaping their decisions or change their decisions about the types of students they recruit or the diversity of courses that they offer. So in the early years, a lot of the value add of the TEF is going to rely on a 15-page submission to the TEF panel, a qualitative submission. And like other sector rating systems, so Ofsted or Care Quality Commission, there's no intention to introduce a visit or an element of peer review. And yet, arguably, that's more important in higher education where there's a lack of good outcomes data, so particularly incompatibility of degree standards. Secondly, there are issues with the unit of analysis that's being proposed. So students make choices at the level of courses, and evidence suggests that there are variations in quality between departments. And yet subject level ratings won't be introduced until 2020, and even then there's no guarantee. Thirdly, the TAF is already looking like it will be quite costly. Institutions won't pay a price to apply for the TAF, but there's no question that new swathes of staff will be introduced to oversee the framework, and there'll be the cost of the different panels, particularly if we move to subject level panels, postgraduate panels. Times Higher Education has already estimated that the cost of the panel alone could be in the region of £500,000 per year. So in light of these very, very real challenges, I can't help but wonder if there's an easier way. One of the other challenges I think that remains to the TAF's success will be the continued use of degree outcomes data. And that's problematic not only because of the incomparability between degree standards, but also given its popularity with employers and students. So evidence suggests about 80% of employers use a 2-1 or above as a cut-off point as part of their recruitment practices. HAPI, the regulator in higher education, is looking into ways to increase comparability in degree standards. But I wonder if there's more that could be done and sooner, and whether those conversations could be better joined up with the TAF proposals. After all, if there were better comparability in standards, you could almost do away with the need for a TAF by providing a better indication of quality that also fosters autonomy and innovation.
Thank you, Lisa. Emma.
Thank you. So my essay in the collection focuses on some of the ways in which I think disruption in the higher education market is not only set to continue, but to increase. And this comes on the back of a period during which we've seen two very significant changes already to the higher education market. One is a shift from relatively stable at an institutional level public grants to a system where the majority of universities' teaching funding is determined by its ability to attract students and the fees that come with those students. That's disruption one. And then disruption two, which I think in practice has probably been more significant, has been the freeing up of student numbers. It can be quite easy to forget sometimes that until very recently in higher education, the size of an institution was set, and the only circumstances under which a university could grow at least its full-time undergraduate population was if it submitted a bid to the funding council and that bid was successful. But we've moved through that, and we're now in a position where student numbers are liberalised. And that on the back of these two disruptions, what my essay focuses on is what's likely to happen over the next 2 or 3 years as the higher education research bill goes through, but actually some of the measures that I talk about don't even require legislation. So one of the measures that is part of the bill is the lowering of entry barriers for new providers in the market. This is quite significant as a legislative matter, and there's quite a lot of changes tied up with it. I actually think this is not that significant for the dynamics of the market itself. And the main reason why I think that is precisely because student numbers have already been liberalised. So what I mean is, I think I could imagine that in a market where existing institutions, the incumbents had their student numbers capped, you could see there was an obvious opportunity for new providers to come in. In a market where existing institutions who benefit from existing market position and the prestige that they've built up over time, the knowledge that potential students have about those institutions, if those institutions can grow and there's no limits on that growth, then I think that's a much more hostile environment for new providers to come into. So my sense of it is that while the legislation will significantly reduce the barriers to entry for new providers, I don't think the next phase of disruption is going to come through the entry of new providers. Instead, I think there's a couple of other changes that are mooted in the government's white paper that are likely to be more significant. The first of those is a much more fluid system for students to move institution during their course. So as people probably know, that is not a phenomenon that is very common currently in the UK higher education system. It's not that common for students to move mid-course. Alongside the government white paper, there's a consultation on switching arrangements for students. And what I try to envisage a bit in my essay is it seems to me the most obvious way in which you could run that switching mechanism is for UCAS, the organisation that currently manages admissions on a sector-wide level, to essentially run a transfer window every year. UCAS comfortably has the technology to be able to do that, it has the reach to be able to do that. Students know that it's the place where you go to apply. If UCAS started running a transfer window every year, my guess is that I think we'll begin to see much more significant levels of switching between institutions during courses. And I think there's two disruptions, I think that has two interesting dynamics. One is when the switching actually takes place, and so the loss of income and the loss of planned income that means for the institution that loses the student and the gain for the other side. But it's also the prospect that students would do this that has a disruptive effect. So universities are currently able to plan on the basis of once they've got a student through the door, they've got that student for 3 years. I think we'll no longer be able to plan so comfortably on that assumption. I think that changes, well, there will be changes when they plan for their income, but I think it also changes manage that pressure point. All the kinds of things that I guess football clubs have got quite used to doing, talking to their star players around the transfer window, and might be the kind of thing we begin to now see universities doing with their students. So I think the kind of the arrangements for transfers and switching, I think, are likely to have quite a significant impact. The other aspect of the white paper that I think will have a significant impact is the requirement for universities to have a student protection plan. Some universities already have this, and the white paper expects universities to be much more explicit about essentially the arrangements that they have in place and the financial reserves that they have in place to teach out their students in the event of institutional failure. So as I see it, for the first time, the white paper represents the government sort of genuinely eyeballing the risk of institutions falling over and requiring institutions to do the same thing, and essentially their university councils, their trustees, their management, to look at that risk and to plan for it. And there is a group of institutions for whom this won't pose any difficulty whatsoever. They're very healthy financially, they've got big reserves, they've got big asset bases. There is equally a large group of universities for whom setting out a student protection plan is going to be a significant challenge. And I think that will provide some disruption on its own. Now, I think it was James who in introduction said that we haven't seen perhaps as much disruption in the higher education market over the last few years as we might have expected given some of the policy change. One of the reasons for that, of course, at least in my view, is that the introduction of fees also meant an increase in the unit of funding. Because most universities went up to the cap on tuition fees, they were able to, in most cases, attract more funding for most courses than they were able to in the past. So in a sense, that increase in the unit of funding helped, I think, a lot of universities to manage what otherwise would have been quite a disruptive time. That increase in the unit of funding is no longer on the table. The white paper explicitly in the legislation will look at this too, about increases in the fee cap for the future, but those increases are only to be in line with inflation, and they're only for the university to get the top mark on the TAF. i.e., unless you get the top mark on the TAF, you will be seeing a real decrease in your funding. So funding is not going to be there to wash out some of these disruptions as it has been in the last few years.
Thank you. 5 minutes.
Okay, I always, as an economist, I'm sort of wince when people talk about market failure, as Joe Johnson has done. I think it doesn't so much say that universities as market institutions have failed, it's just they haven't been given enough opportunity to really get out there. There are many boastful claims about higher education in this country. It's the world's greatest and highest citation rates and all that kind of stuff. I think these are often overblown, but nevertheless, it's certainly not the case that higher education in Britain is a sort of failing Tata Steel type operation which needs to be propped up by the government and crawled all over by regulators and so on. The government is concerned with, I think, 4 things. It's concerned with research, it's concerned with teaching quality, it's concerned with employability, it's also concerned with social mobility. So I just want to say a few things about all of those. First of all, research. I'm not a huge fan of the research assessment exercise or the research excellence framework, as it is now known. I've been through this many, many times. I think when assessment of university research first came in the late 1980s, it was actually quite a good thing. I don't think it is any longer. I think the REF is a hugely overblown, expensive operation which diverts the attention of staff away from their main function, which is teaching, towards research, which is actually only, for most universities, only a tiny proportion of their total income. I would scrap the research excellence framework. If there is a need for core funding for universities and some kind of QR basis, which Paul had mentioned, then I think it could be done quite easily through citations and research degree completions and things like this. And attempts to simulate the results of the REF actually come up with a very close result in terms of these kind of indicators. So instead of scrapping the REF, which I think we ought to, the government is inventing a TEF, Teaching Excellence Framework, which we've heard about. At least the REF does involve some experts involved, on panels, who we can recognise and we know that they're good people in their disciplines and so forth. There is no such equivalent thing for the panels which have been dreamed up for the Teaching Excellence Framework thing. This is going to be setting down rules about a particular way in which we should teach and so on. As it's been suggested, it's going to rely very heavily on indicators. It's going to be document driven. We'll be writing endless 15-page documents. What font size should we use for that? You know, how many, or can we use footnotes? All those kind of stuff. Document production, universities are very good at, but whether we actually gain anything from this, I don't know. Certainly the idea of tying the teaching excellence framework to funding, I think, is a big mistake. It won't work. We know from experience in Australia and other places that it doesn't work. We should anyway be thinking about permanent caps on fees. What we need is a more market-driven regulation, and I hope James was going to talk about this a bit later on, because I feel that the way we ought to go is to have some kind of shared funding of places by institutions, so they've got some skin in the game. And when they take on a student, they take on a financial commitment, and that will drive them to boost employability, which is the third thing which I mentioned on that list. The final thing which I find a bit difficult in the white paper is the emphasis on social mobility and attempts to socially engineer intakes and success rates. This sort of thing, which the old Soviet Union used to practice on quite a large scale, is unlikely to work either. The problems which prevent youngsters getting into university and so forth are problems basically in the school system and in the home. They're not to do with universities. To drag universities into some massive social engineering project where they're trying to respond to targets which, for example, David Cameron picked this one out of the air, about 20% of BME students and this kind of thing. I think this is nonsense, and I think it will lead to bad things in the end. So those are the four areas which I see in this white paper as being controversial. What I don't see in the paper is any judgment at all about what higher education is for. I look back over at Lord Robinson's work, the great liberal economist, Lord Robinson, who really started the expansion of higher education in this country back in 1960. He was talking about the kind of values which universities ought to inculcate. Now his language seems very old-fashioned, but I think there is a real issue here, which Pauline briefly touched on, which is about the idea of universities as being areas for free speech and for discourse which everybody has access to. And I would like to hear a lot more about that from the government and less about all this meddling and interference.
Thank you very much, Len. Okay, we're going to go to the floor now. Peter, I'm going to ask if you will give us your reflections at the end in closing, okay? I won't do you out of your slot. So, you can keep your comments brief, take questions as concise and to the point as quickly as possible. I'm going to take several comments and go from there. So, we're not doing without a mic, so speak up. Yes, Philip.
Okay, three very brief comments. Firstly, I think it's an odd stage at which to introduce a reform like this when the cap has been taken off student numbers and there's much more freedom being given to institutions in relation to student numbers. If that didn't work in 5 or 10 years' time, well, one might look at the issue. It's very, very strange to do it in the year that this is actually coming into effect. Secondly, Len and I wrote a paper on the research excellence framework, and when we discussed it with the government, they kind of rejected all of the problems that we raised in relation to the research excellence framework, except they did agree that the research excellence framework distorted the allocation of resources to a significant extent away from teaching. And they said, but we have a solution to this, and that is to introduce a teaching excellence framework, a regulatory framework which will remove the distortions caused by this other regulatory framework. And it's just a case of regulation begets more regulation, I'm afraid, and the gaming that comes out of this, I think, will be extraordinary. Thirdly, I think perhaps most importantly, because this is a sort of continuation of a trend, you get governments and government bodies to a greater extent talking about consumers as if their behaviour is the problem. So the CMA, in relation to its energy market investigation, talks about disengaged consumers, in other words, consumers who can't be bothered to switch. Similar with the banking investigation. Similar, it would appear, with in relation to university students. But the sorts of things which students might or might not take into account are not a material problem. It really doesn't matter whether students know whether a 2-1 from all universities is equal or not equal. What matters is whether or not they make good choices. I don't think you get AAA students sort of knocking on the door trying to get into otherwise very mediocre universities because they think that 2-1s from those mediocre universities are as good as 2-1s from Oxford, Cambridge and UCL.
Thank you. Other comments, questions? No? Okay, right. We'll go to responses.
Yes, I agree with you about the student number controls and the removal of the cap on student numbers. So I've been reporting on higher education on and off for 20 years. Only twice in those 20 years have I actually thought, what? Where did that come from? I remember it was my birthday. I was planning to take the afternoon off. I'd done a lot of extra work, and then George Osborne stood up in the Commons and announced the removal of the cap on student numbers, and I realised that was no longer going to be a good plan for the rest of the week. So no, I completely agree with you that that was a, to me, very brave and bold step, which has not yet been played out, and I quite agree that we would usefully see that play out further before doing anything else. Rep and TEP, yes, absolutely. You can't cure the bureaucracy of the rep by introducing them to the TEP. And on the CMA, I do worry when we focus only on AAA students. Most students aren't AAA students.
Just nip the station. I think students go to the best universities they can on the whole.
Yes, but I don't think that they necessarily make well-informed choices, and that they are subject to influence by their peers and by their teachers and by their parents, and those people aren't always the best informed either.
Yeah, I'm just going to pick up on the point about disengaged consumers. So, I mean, certainly when the CMA were doing the inquiry, they didn't talk in terms of market figures, so that wasn't the kind of the narrative around their report. But they did focus in on information as kind of a core aspect of a functioning market. And I think that, you know, there's certainly evidence that students don't research the factors that they say are important to them. So, for example, we know that improving employment outcomes is the number one reason that students go to university, and about 38% research that to determine their choice. But we do see sort of students sort of claiming that they regretted their choice or would have made different choices in hindsight. I mean, again, the figures are about 30% of people that we researched said that they would have conducted more research or considered a different option. And I think that the kind of, while there's no evidence of really poor practice in higher education, I think that, you know, some universities have been able to kind of ride on the power of their brand, and I think that there could be more that could be done to kind of really shake up quality and drive and to focus more on quality among students than is the case at the moment.
Your point though about how long term is the measurable outcome is exactly why measuring something that occurs at the time of university is so inappropriate, because it's measuring a thing at a particular point when the outcome is going to take a very long period of time. And the problem you refer to about assessing the value of something, again, in the financial markets we're familiar with, which is when a company seeks financing, the investment community judges its earnings stream over a 10, 20, 30-year period, so the same sort of horizon, and the investment management community is there to make an assessment of what that long-term future earnings stream is going to be. So the problem you refer to is one that is familiar to finance and has been addressed.
Do you want to?
Well, I take Julian's point. I'm not trying to defend producers in this sense, but you know, my preference is for a scheme such as Peter is going to outline shortly, where universities have a skin in the game and are involved in developing employability from that point of view. My problem with the TEF is all the measures which have been mentioned in the documentation so far are really not measures of teaching, they're measures of something else. For many years, as a head of business schools, I was trying to get our staff to accept proper assessment by students, which was available to managers to have a look at. The unions prevented this. It was never possible to get direct observation of people's teaching. So all you could rely on was complaints from students, which is not a very good way of doing this. It could be, I suppose, a TEF which did involve very detailed visits to institutions, watching large numbers of staff and so forth, might get something to do with the quality of teaching, but that would be colossally expensive, and it's not what's on the agenda here. What's on the agenda is using second or third hand indicators to infer something. Another point.
With all due respect, that's what you suggested we do in the case of the ref.
Pardon?
The second or third hand indicator, the citations would actually correlate very well with the quality.
But look, citations and things like that are fairly objective, Julian. I mean, you know what quality of journals, for example, in a particular discipline, what kind of papers get into those journals and so forth. I mean, I think it's a whole different point. But I would just like to take up another point from Alison about this idea that the students are irrational in some sense, or that they're not.
No, it's not fully rational.
They're not fully. Well, I don't know. You see, all the assumption here is that students should base their judgments on things like employability and so forth. In fact, students don't necessarily do this. They do it in relation to location of places. Is it a nice place? Is it a safe place? Is it a secure place? Is it the kind of place my parents would let me go and live, which for a significant minority of students is an important factor. Are there sporting facilities? Because I fancy myself as an athlete or whatever it is. These kind of things which enter into choice, I think are quite legitimate. And we shouldn't say that it's all about teaching quality, it's all about employability. There are many other things as well.
Thank you. Yes. Question back.
The thing that concerns me is the sort of imprecision of terms here. I'm really comfortable with the concept of a market between institutions, but I've had sales roles, and I've worked with colleagues who use the word customer all the time. When you use the word customer and apply it to a student, you immediately undermine the fundamental relationship of trust and respect between teacher and student, and that's very dangerous. I think that's very dangerous, and I think the Americans have seen the way that's gone over years.
Why? Sorry.
Because they're partners in an educational project. They're not
yeah.
there to be served.
Yeah.
But it's not a customer relationship.
It's not a customer relationship at all. A customer relationship, I mean, businesses don't like to think of customers as individuals. It's incredibly inconvenient to do that. That's why they have customer services departments.
Yeah.
These are individuals, and you work with them as individuals, and you have an essential relationship of trust and respect. All teachers do, whatever sector they work in. And at the moment you think of yourself as an individual, if you think of yourself as a customer of this person, it transforms your relationship towards them. I think quite radically. I'm very comfortable with it at an institutional level, but when you do it at an individual level, the impact's quite severe.
Okay. So I think that links actually what Len was saying with what Louisa was saying about, for me there's quite a difference between what people say they want and what people actually want. And I think that taps into your idea of the student as the customer. That sort of would then tempt your academic to give the student what he or she says she wants, which is high grades at minimal effort, she said, and what they actually need, what they actually want, which is probably could be a decent job on graduation, which would require having done some work at university.
Yes.
So I was just going to say, on that point about consumers, I entirely understand your point. I guess there's many sort of consumer relationships that are two-way. Many service industries, like people always talk about the gym, and there's a two-way relationship. And I see the problems with sort of using that terminology, but I also see the potential to inform a student and educate for both sides to be very clear about what their role and responsibilities and expectations on both sides are. And so I think part of that, one of the things that students say is that they're not aware how much private study they should do when they start their course, and that's not clear. And we see that very different levels of private study being undertaken in different institutions, and that's just one example where I think that actually I understand the problem with consumer language, but by making things very clear about expectations on both sides, that could actually have good outcomes.
Good. Any other questions? We've got time for 2 more, I think, but quick comments and questions. Yes?
Yeah, I just had one about alternative providers. I was interested to hear Emma say you didn't think that we'd be flooded with new providers, and I have a tendency to agree with you on that. But one thing which we've seen already by the existing alternative providers in the sector is that they tend to operate, I think the most recent statistics, over 50% of them in the sort of law, business studies, palm high, sell cheap sort of space. And the problem, I think, existing universities feel with that sort of element of growth, that side of the market, is that they use a lot of the funds as a real complex sort of investment programme that sits behind university to do not just research, but also civic responsibility and quite a lot of the other investments that universities make. So we're sort of asking students to make a decision on the basis of teaching quality, but that money might actually be used to do a lot more than that, and maybe students won't be using that information to make their decisions. So is it a free market in that sense?
Respond to that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that is probably right. There is probably more of an opportunity for alternative providers around sort of professional and vocational courses of that sort, especially those that aren't particularly capital intensive to teach. I think for an alternative provider to come in and teach an engineering course is much more difficult because the capital intensity is a direct model of teaching. Law and business would be significantly easier. But even if that's true, it seems to me that incumbent institutions who have law courses or business courses should in most cases be able to compete those alternative providers based on the wider offer that they have as an institution, unless that alternative provider is functioning in a geography where there isn't much higher education provision, or is at a price point that a traditional or the incumbent university can't match. So I think there are opportunities. I don't want to say there are no opportunities for alternative providers. I think they'll just have to find their opportunities in a much more targeted way.
Thank you. Okay, I've asked Peter to give us a few reflections. Peter Ainsworth here is one of the contributors to the volume, has written for the IEA and has a forthcoming paper in Economic Affairs on the subject that he's going to speak to us about now, which I'll leave him to embellish.
Very quickly.
Yes, 3 minutes.
3 minutes of it.
Yeah.
Yes, so Baroness Perry, I think everybody here would agree that we can be very proud of our university sector. It does a fantastic job on the whole. But a couple of statistics that indicate that there may be a problem. One is the Oxford National Statistics publishes the proportion of graduates who remain in non-graduate level employment, so employment they could have obtained without the higher education, 5 years after they've left university. And in fact, a third of graduates are in that position. So a third, that's quite a large proportion of our graduates still 5 years after they've left. So by now they've gone travelling or whatever, and yet they're in jobs they could have got if they had not had a higher education. So that suggests a bit of a problem. Another one, there's a new study out by the Institute for Fiscal Studies that had access to HMRC data, and they established that at 23 universities or higher education institutions, after 10 years, the median graduates, so even undergraduates are one in the middle and all the below ones, were actually earning less than the median non-graduate. Now, there may be some issues with geography there. They may all be graduates of northern universities and the average overall is London, but certainly that again suggests there's a problem. If half of the graduates of these universities are making less than people who didn't go to university at all. So there is a case for thinking, is something wrong? And Professor Alison Wolfe has written about this, and she suggested that the fundamental problem is the regulations the government has put in place, but also the financial incentives facing university don't direct them towards long-term employability. So from an economic theory point of view, the way you would address this is to compensate universities in proportion to the value added that they added to their students' careers. Unfortunately, in practice, you can't do this exactly, because in order to know how much value has been added, you need a counterfactual. You need to know what would the student have earned if you've not gone to university. And given we only live one life at a time, you can never know that. But we face the same problem in relation to what students should pay for their education. On one hand, you've got how much the universities should get, on the other hand, you've got how much the students get. And there is now a consensus that income contingent payments are appropriate. Harry Petrinas wrote extensively about this in his paper. Now, income contingent payments are not necessarily exactly in line with the benefit each individual student gets, but payments are a proportion of earnings without adjustment for the counterfactual, nevertheless are the best proxy we have. My suggestion, quite simply, is that at the moment we have the students paying on an income contingent basis, but the universities charge a fixed fee. My proposal is we harmonise both sides of the transaction. And so the universities, I call it a risk-sharing system, so the universities now would be paid in proportion to the average incomes of their graduates. Now, again, it's not a true measure of added value, but it's the best single proxy we have. It's quantitative, objective, and although it develops over time, at any point in time you have a long history. This IFS study already has 10 years of data, so we have very good information already on the past performance of our universities on that basis. So this has some very attractive attributes, this risk-sharing approach. The first one is that it aligns the incentives of the student and the university to optimise employability over the long term, not just thinking about how do they do in the 3 years. Did they get a good lesson? Was the teacher good? But what's the impact over the whole working life of the student, of the graduate? And what in particular it should lead to is an increase in the number of academics who are expert in pedagogy. Len Shackleton actually noted there's currently a lack of academics who study this. So they're there to be effective at teaching, and yet it's not something that academics study in particular. There's probably a lot that can be done to work out how do we most successfully communicate the right knowledge and the right skills into our students. It should also raise the importance of the careers and alumni liaison teams, who now would have a real interest in providing long-term after-sales care to their clients, the students, in accordance with the need for lifelong learning identified in his paper by Nima Sanandaji. A very attractive aspect is that regulation can be almost wholly eliminated, because now if a university doesn't deliver a worthwhile product, it will suffer a financial cost. So, as Professor Wolf was suggesting, if you align the incentives, you get the desirable outcome, and you shouldn't need so much regulation. Now, I know there's a lot of concerns that risk sharing might cause universities to eliminate courses that lead to low earnings. Any such course would need to be redesigned under this scheme, but that does not mean that the subject of study needs to be changed. The evidence is that apart from medical careers and a few specific technical fields, businesses care much more about a graduate's attitudes and aptitudes than about the actual subject they studied at university. So as long as a course is rigorous and helps develop good working practices, there's no reason why any particular subject should not be offered. In relation to disadvantaged students, you could copy the pupil premium approach to address that issue. So looking ahead, computerization will continue to transform the workplace and also transform the opportunities for delivery of higher education, and universities need to be able to adapt to this so they can continue to offer a service that justifies its relatively high cost. The government, I would argue, is putting the university sector into a straitjacket, and that will prevent them adapting and risks their relevance in the future, whereas risk sharing would make them free to experiment and thrive.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's a creative and joined up piece of policy thinking, and Peter's essay to you. As also the volume itself, as Baroness Perry was kind enough to say in her remarks about the volume, it's an unusual collection of very thoughtful essays on a very difficult and timely subject. So please read and disseminate to those that you know that would be interested.